This is MTG Burgeoning, and in this video we are going to update and upgrade our Kozilek the Great Distortion Colorless EDH deck. Thank you for joining us for another installment of the Up and Up series. Today it's Kozilek the Great Distortion. We've got 4 cards going in and 4 cards coming out, 2 of which are going to alter the land base. But before doing so, let me take a moment to remind you that in the description of this video, you will find links to this build's deck tech, the up to the 2nd deck list, as well as the video primer series. Alright, card number 1, which is also land number 1 going into the 99 of this build today, and that is Deserted Temple. It taps for a colorless mana, or we can pay a generic mana and tap it to untap target land. This helps our lands ramp by just tapping them. Imagine all of the different lands that we have that can tap to produce more than 1 colorless mana. Well, we can use one of those 2+ colorless mana to activate Deserted Temple to untap that land and get more of that mana. This is just making a fast deck even more fast. I guess we'll go with that. With Deserted Temple going in, it's simply going to replace a Wastes. Now, we will never, and I stand staunchly firm on this regard, we will never run a full land base with all non-basic lands. We will have wastes. We will have basics. We will never do that because we will never lose out on the benefits of getting Assassin's Trophied or Path to Exile or Field of Ruin or any of those other cards that allow us to put a free basic land into play. We do have enough wastes right now to yield to some better utility options, of course. And in this case, Deserted Temple in, and that waste is out. Land number 2 going in to the 99 of this build, and one that would pair with Deserted Temple just deliciously, and that is Eugen's Labyrinth. Here we have a land with the imprint mechanic, so when Eugen's Labyrinth comes into play, we may exile a colorless card with mana value 7 or more from our hand. That should not be a problem in this deck. We can tap this for a colorless mana, and if we have a card exiled with Eugen's Labyrinth, we add 2 colorless mana instead. As an even greater bonus, we can tap and return the exiled card to our hand. Eugen's Labyrinth is going to do so much work in this build. The ability for it to tap for the extra mana without taking 2 points of damage a la Ancient Tomb, and not with the restrictions of Temple of the False God. All we need is a colorless card with 7 or more mana value in our hand, and again, that is not going to be a problem. Eugen's Labyrinth instantly becomes one of the most powerful lands in this deck. With its presence going in, it's going to replace the weakest land in our hand, which, let's face it, it's a waste. We still have multiple wastes in the 99, so we do have a little bit of wiggle room to get rid of the weakest land in our deck to make way for what could be the most powerful. Alright, next card going into the 99 of this build. It doesn't necessarily... Well, I guess we could say it does affect the land base in some way, because if you scroll through the deck list right now, you'll see that we have numerous lands that have a sacrifice ability to them. And once they get sacrificed and put into our graveyard, well, guess what? We're all colorless here. It's very, very difficult to get those bad boys back. However, it gets a lot easier when we add Crucible of Worlds. Here we have an artifact for 3 generic mana that allows us to play land cards from our graveyard. So we could sacrifice those lands, have them hit our graveyard, get the benefits of their activated abilities, and then with Crucible of Worlds on our side of the battlefield, we can simply play those lands from our graveyard. A fantastic addition to a build that, until I looked closely, didn't seem like it would be a very good fit. Well, I was very surprised at how many lands we have that can sacrifice for some ability, and it's more than I thought it was. So Crucible of Worlds is definitely going to help out the land base here, particularly because with some of those sacrifice abilities, to get them to be able to do them over and over and over again, it can be very, very deflating for our opponents. Crucible of Worlds in, and it is going to replace Unwinding Clock. Now, this was an artifact that allowed us to untap all artifacts we control during each other player's untap step. So this is kind of like colorless versions of Seedborn Muse, except it's a little more restrictive because it's just for artifacts. As powerful as that sounds, we don't have a ton of cards in the current 99 of this build that can benefit from having all of our artifacts untap during every player's turn. I mean, we have a couple. I mean, there's a few out there, but I gotta think that Crucible of Worlds is going to have a greater impact for us than Unwinding Clock, particularly because by the time we get to the end of this video, one of the cards in the current 99 of that deck is coming out that would be very useful for Unwinding Clock. It's this card right here. So I think in the confines of this build and all of the lands that we have that have sacrifice abilities, Crucible of Worlds is going to do more work for us than Unwinding Clock. So let's get rid of a card that we're not really built for anymore. It was a pretty decent card during this deck's inception when we first put it together, but that was some years ago. And over time, we have seen many more powerful colorless cards getting printed, which are getting slam dunked into the 99 of this build, and it's making it more difficult to reconcile keeping cards that aren't doing enough. And Crucible of Worlds, again, I think it's going to do more in this deck than Unwinding Clock. The fourth and final card going into the 99 of this build for today. All right, Kozilek, here we go. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready to get back with one of your old school chums? But which old school chum is it? It was only a matter of time until a copy became available that we could just grab and slide into this deck and make everything feel like sunshine and lollipops. Emrakul, The World Anew. A 12/12. Yep, that's right. A 12/12 for 12. That's 12 generic mana for a 12/12. When we cast Emrakul, we gain control of all creatures target player controls. That right there is a fantastic ability in a deck that, in some ways, really struggles with mass removal. There are some cards that we had in this deck, and there are some cards that we still have that can manage it, but in some ways, it ends up hurting us too. And in some ways, Emrakul ends up hurting us as well. But we'll take that risk because of all the benefits that are tied to this massive Eldrazi. So with a 12/12, it has flying. It has protection from spells. Protection from spells. That pretty much means you're not getting rid of it with spot removal. Your instants and sorcery spells are going to do nothing, so you better hope you have an ability of one of your cards that can help. And even that, it's protection from permanents that were cast this turn, so you better hope they're already in play or they can stay on the battlefield for a turn in order to get rid of Emrakul. And when Emrakul dies... I'm sorry, I said it the wrong way. When Emrakul leaves the battlefield, she doesn't have to die for this last ability to trigger. We sacrifice all creatures we control. We do have biggins in this deck. This is not a creature deck by any means. This is a straight colorless deck. We operate with a lot of mana rocks and, just a big colorless creature here, a big colorless creature there. So we could be hurt by having to sacrifice some of our biggins. Now, some of them are auto shuffles that go right back into our graveyard, and some of them are not. What's more important is that we will end up gaining control of all of one of our opponent's creatures that we can use to help whittle down the rest of our opponent's life totals much more quickly. There is also the potential to cast Emrakul for 6 colorless mana through its Madness mechanic, but we would have to find a way to discard her in order to do that. More often than not, we're just going to straight cold cast her for the 12, gain all those creatures, hopefully be able to stay on the battlefield, and then just end up winning the game with the instant army that we just amassed being led into combat by Emrakul, The World Anew. So with Emrakul going in, it's going to replace Walking Ballista. Now, this was one of the cards that we were alluding to that synergizes pretty well with Unwinding Clock. It's an XX spell, so that means whenever we cast the spell, you have to pay the same amount for each instance of X. And then when Walking Ballista would enter the battlefield, it does so with X +1/+1 counters. We could remove a +1/+1 counter at any time to have Walking Ballista deal 1 damage to any target, and we can pay 4 generic mana to put a +1/+1 counter on to Walking Ballista. So with Unwinding Clock, this was really the number one card that would benefit from having all of our artifacts untapped during each player's turn, so that we can jam more and more mana into the Ballista, getting more and more +1/+1 counters onto it, and then allowing those counters to be taken off to deal more and more direct damage across the table or straight to the faces of our opponents. With that long game mentality in mind, I think the instant potential win of what Emrakul gives us is going to have a much more resonating impact on the game and on the battlefield than what Walking Ballista and Unwinding Clock were doing. In fact, with the presence of Crucible of Worlds and Emrakul, I think we have ways in which to really lock down an opponent, or multiple opponents depending on what lands we keep sacrificing and bringing back from our graveyard. All right, there you have it, MTG BC. 4 new cards into the 99 of our Kozilek build. You let me know your thoughts about these changes in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, a yo channel for all things Magic.